Hey there, welcome to the DFS build. I'm Kevin Roberts, looking to go over the Showdown slate. The last game before the NBA Finals, probably. Game 4 in Dallas. The Mavs are up 3-0 in the series against the Minnesota Timberwolves. Very likely that this is the end. Kind of funny, too, because just about a week ago, everybody was, kind of parading around their Minnesota championship tickets. They did look pretty good, but Dallas has emerged as a legit threat to win the whole thing this year. So, with the series obviously in Dallas for game 4, I anticipate a full sweep here and us all advancing to the NBA Finals. But before that happens, we can make some money, and that is what we're going to try to do here. So, a quick recap of yesterday. I personally didn't get a takedown, but if you used my advice in yesterday's showdown analysis, you should have been on your way to having a shot because the winning lineup had Andrew Nembhard in the captain slot. Obviously, I love Nembhard with Tyrese Haliburton out. I said he was more than viable as captain once again. I personally wanted to get a little bit different at captain just because Nembhard was the previous captain takedown winner, so it just makes sense to try to deviate a little bit. And he was 14% owned as the captain, so it's not like he was contrarian there. He was fairly owned, but it ended up being the winning play. Either way, I liked him a lot. Loved Tatum. He had 56 fantasy points. I liked Derek White, especially liked him as a leverage on Drew Holiday. He had 13 more fantasy points than Drew Holiday, so that worked out. I liked Obi Toppin as a solid value off the bench. He had 25 fantasy points. The only play that really didn't work out for me that I liked was Miles Turner. He had like 13 fantasy points. He was a total dud. And then I think Ben Shepherd was just he was just okay for the price. But I mean, he was gonna get 26 minutes. He was 3K, and he just made a lot of sense as a utility option for a showdown. So one thing that did come up in the comment section was somebody was surprised when they were looking at the DFS Hero ownership projections, and then when they got into their single entry lineup, they saw that the captain they used went from whatever it was 6 to 10% projected ownership to 25% ownership in a single entry. So obviously, just a reminder that ownerships and projections, all these things they are projections. So taking them completely as they are, I would take it with a grain of salt every time, just because other people are also going through these optimizers and making their own calls, and these are just projections. So once we get into the contest, those numbers can definitely fluctuate quite a bit. It does change specifically when you move to just a general projection for ownership to a smaller single entry tournament, because then you're looking at sharper players and you're looking at that ownership just kind of being narrowed down a little bit. So if a guy's coming in at 10% ownership overall on a slate, go into single entry, that might jump to 20-25% in a single entry. If a guy's coming in at 45% owned in general, and he's really, really chalky on the slate, you get into a single entry, he might be like 80% owned, if not more. I mean, then you start looking at showdown slates, and then you're looking at just monster ownership. I mean, look at last, for the Boston game in the last slate. Jason Tatum, I think he was coming in projecting for like 56% or 60% overall ownership. But when you get into a showdown slate, his ownership was actually 85%. So just something to keep in mind. You cannot take it, 100% anything like that. It's just once you get into the contest, things can change. All right, so that does it for yesterday's recap. Hopefully we can get a takedown today. If this video helps you in any way, please give it a like and also consider subscribing to the channel. Those things help me out a lot. Let me know that I'm helping you out. And then also you get alerted to future videos by doing that. All right, so also this video is sponsored by DFS Hero. If you want to try out a new lineup optimizer tool, you can give them a shot. 50% off discount if you hit the video link in the description below, or the link in the video description below. All right, let's get to it. Mavs and Timberwolves. Obviously, the Mavs are at home. They're favored. The series is probably going to end, but they're not favored by much. They're only 1.5 point favorites, and this total is 210.5. So obviously, Minnesota is capable of playing really good defense. Dallas has actually been good defensively. Excuse me. I mean, Minnesota has not scored more than 108 points in a single game in the series. So Dallas has been pretty impressive on the defensive end. And just naturally, this game is going to be a little bit slower pace. So it actually has had a decent amount of points so far in every game. Both teams have scored over 105 points, so a little bit better than expected. So the 210 total sounds about right, and I think it is what it is. It's the only game we have to work with, so I wouldn't get too worked up about that. But I think there's still major potential for a lot of plays here. Obviously, starting off the bat, let's look at the captain plays first. Luka Dončić looks amazing with a 91.74 fantasy projection at DFS Hero. He comes in the lineup at optimal lineup 28% of the time. If we shift over and look at his overall ownership, he's coming at 65% owned. So if we kind of relate that to what I was talking about Tatum, he's probably going to be like 90% owned overall. And the captain, I'm still going to guess 25% owned, about there, 25 to 30%. The reality is he's got the best floor, the best ceiling, best projection, just across the board. He's a smash play. You can always play Luka in the Showdown slate. The only problem is he's 20.7K as the captain. That's 6,000 more than any other Mavs player, and it is 3,300 more than Anthony Edwards. So a little bit restrictive to use him in the captain slot, although obviously it's tough to not use the guy who's going to get 60 to maybe 70 fantasy points as like the max player to get 1.5 times points. So if I was running 150 lineups, I would definitely have a lot of Luka in the captain. But you know me, that's just the way I do. I want to get a little bit of instant leverage at the captain slot. So I'm not always looking for punts like, Jaden McDaniels or something. But I do want to look for other ways to get a little creative at captain. And then just in general, maybe pick one or two other spots across my lineup to be getting towards guys who are a little bit under-owned. But eating some good chalk is very, very necessary to having success here. So Luka looks awesome. Play him however you like, but you should play him a good deal no matter what, whether you captain him a lot or whether you just let him ride in the utility slot a lot. Either way, he should be in your lineups most of the time, I would say. Anthony Edwards looks, again, like the top pivot off of Luka in the captain slot, just because he has the second best projection of the entire slate. He offers the best ceiling of the entire slate outside of Luka. He's only in the optimal lineup in the captain slot 8% of the time. But that could mean his ownership is a little bit lower. And honestly, he has not been like a total beast in this series. He was really, really good. Actually, that's not true. I'm sorry. He's actually been pretty good for fantasy for this series. 51 plus fantasy points in 2 of the last 3 games. I don't know what I was thinking when I was saying that. I was thinking maybe when I was tracking the games recently, it's more about his scoring has just not been really, really good. Like in game 1, he did have 51 fantasy points, but he only scored 19 points and he shot 37%. And in game 2 was 39 fantasy points. So certainly not what you want when you're paying up. Certainly not for captain spot either. And he shot 29% there. So I did mention the last time I broke down the Mavs Wolves game that eventually he's going to get going. He's an elite scorer, and it was a huge game. And sure enough, in 43 minutes, he had 11 of 24 shots and had 26 real points, and he had another 50 plus fantasy point game. So I would imagine Anthony Edwards again shows up. The season's on the line. I expect him to have a solid game. He's the first direct pivot at captain for Luka, and I'll have a good amount of him in utility as well. Just because, I mean, if 39 points is his floor here and it's like a must-win game, I think that's I feel pretty comfortable about that. If there's a chance that he's going to be a low-owned captain, then he looks really appealing as captain as well. Obviously, 17,000 is a lot for a captain, but with Luka being 3K more, it's not as daunting for sure. So he'll be a little bit less owned than Luka, but still very, very viable. Kyrie Irving has been turning it on in the series. He's got 30 plus real points in 2 of the 3 games. I had said going into the series that I could see something like that happening after he struggled against OKC. It's not like the matchup against Minnesota has been easier. I mean, Mike Conley is a very good on-ball defender, and Kyrie is just getting it done. I don't know if we can keep banking on 30-point explosions, and just because that's never really that sustainable. And then if he's not doing that, I don't know if he's going to get us there because he's not doing a whole lot else beyond, scoring. So he's certainly viable, continues to be viable in captain just because he has exhibited a little bit of a ceiling. But even when he's really hitting, he hasn't topped 45 fantasy points yet in this series. And I don't think he's done that in entire playoffs. No, he did. He did a couple times against the Clippers. but still, lately has not exhibited a high DFS ceiling. He's been just rock solid 43, 44, whatever fantasy points. That's totally cool and fine. Still captain viable and certainly a decent utility play. You switch over to utility. He has 9.6K though, so a little bit expensive, especially when you have some really nice mid-range guys on the slate. So I'm not making Kyrie a core play by any means. Like I feel like Luka and Edwards, if I can do it and feel good about it, I want them at least in my utility spot. So if Kyrie's going to be like reasonably low owned, he's coming at 48% owned, I would have a lot more interest. But if he's going to be really, really chalky, I might go a little bit underweight on him just because his price has ticked up, and I'm thinking he's going to be a little bit more owned than what we're seeing here. All right, so as far as captain other options, Cat and Rudy and PJ all look really good and would be obviously less owned. These guys are all carrying ownership as they should. Rudy is actually the lowest owned utility option that we're seeing right now, which makes sense because he's not exhibited much of a ceiling. He's coming off a really lame outing, 29 minutes, 5 fouls, 19 fantasy points. I've been kind of high on him just because historically he's got a really nice floor and he's just got a clear path to success. And I didn't think he would really struggle this much in this series, but he has. Worth noting that Derek Lively is out after sustaining a concussion in the last game. So maybe that helps Rudy a little bit. I don't know. But Rudy at 12K for the captain and 8K in general is still appealing to me. I'm not going to fall into the recency bias trap and just like ignore Rudy Gobert just because he, had one bad game. He had 39 fantasy points the game before. We know he can, clean the glass. We know he can rack up blocks. So if he can actually start playing like we know he can play, Rudy Gobert looks like a decent value. And I like that he's not super owned. So that's certainly appealing. Cat obviously has a better ceiling just because he can hit threes and blow up as a scorer. He has not been very good in the series. He's not top 34 fantasy points at all yet. So if he's going to be mega owned, he's coming at 51%. I'd be a little bit underweight. And once again, I would probably just go to Rudy over Cat there. That doesn't mean I would want no exposure to Cat. And for sure in the captain slot, we could just hope that Cat just, explodes and finally has a big like 55 or 50 fantasy point game. Certainly possible. But yeah, if I'm looking at those two guys, I continue to prefer Rudy, especially when we look at the ownership. So I was really high on PJ Washington as the captain last game, and he disappointed a little bit, especially with Derek Lively going out. I was like, okay, well, I had Derek Lively in like half my lineups. I think it was actually more than half, so that really held me back naturally. And he was doing great too. He had 14 fantasy points like right away, and then he got knocked out of the game. But anyways, once he left, I was like, okay, well, I have quite a few lineups with PJ Washington at captain, so maybe this could be awesome for me. He did play 40 minutes. He was good. He had 16 real points and 8 rebounds. Like that's not a bad game, obviously, but it only equated to 30 fantasy points. And that wasn't good enough in the captain slot. It just wasn't. So he was certainly a decent utility option, but he didn't get there. I'm okay with kind of just running it back. I mean, PJ Washington, he is a little bit chalky at 42%. So I wouldn't really love him so much necessarily at utility. I think he's fine at 7.2 in utility. But I think he, again, is a really interesting captain play. He has shown a ceiling. He had a 58 fantasy point game in the previous series. He's had multiple games over 40 fantasy points. The Mavs like going to him. He is that third scoring option behind, Luka and Kyrie. So he can get going and he can explode. So I'm going to go right back to the well. I'm not going to go only at PJ Washington at captain, but I do like him again as a captain for sure. I think he's going to be owned across the board in general, but at captain, he should be, again, pretty contrarian. As far as cheap guys go in the captain, I'll say that, you can do whatever you want. You can play these guys, but the only one I really am interested in the captain is when we're looking at value would be Daniel Gafford. He's coming at 6.6 in the utility. So he looks really good in the utility. No problem eating that chalk. He's coming at 39%. Like when you're looking at him and PJ for utility, I certainly prefer Gafford for just the utility because he's a little bit cheaper. But he's also viable for captain. I don't think he's going to be super owned in captain, obviously, because we looked at all these other plays that are going to offer a better ceiling. They're going to play more minutes. They just have a better floor. Like across the board, they are, better captain plays. But with no Lively there, Gafford is possibly going to eat up a ton of minutes down low. And we saw it right away last game, 29 minutes. So could he be looking at a 30, 35-minute game? Sure. And obviously he can, get blocks and rebounds and get, easy buckets inside, assuming he can get by Rudy. So, yeah, so Gafford at that price looks rock solid for utility, and I like him as a sprinkling of Daniel Gafford in the captain slot. And we've seen Jaden McDaniels pop off a few times in the series now. He came back a little bit last game with 15 real points, 19 fantasy points. So he's still, like I said, the hot shooting he was doing, it was not really sustainable. And sure enough, last 2 games, he's been a bust at his price. I think at 6K flat utility, he remains viable just because he plays a ton and he's shown that he has a ceiling. And if he's going to just erupt again and try to save the Wolves season, you can consider him in the captain slot. Same goes for Derek Jones Jr. because he's going to play a lot. And of course, Naz Reid, who's been a monster off the bench for the Wolves. He had 34 fantasy points 2 games ago. So if he can do something like that again, although asking him to hit 7 threes is a little bit of a reach, but he does have a little bit of a ceiling, so he can save you some money in the captain. And if he gets 35 to 40 fantasy points, that could work out for you. The other guy would be Kyle Anderson, but I just don't want to go dumpster diving for my captain slot. It's been working out a little bit in the playoffs, but also I would probably keep it fairly top heavy with Luka, with Ant, and then I like PJ Washington quite a bit as my third guy there, and then maybe a sprinkling of Kyrie, maybe even Rudy. So looking at these other guys for utility, and not really a captain of mine. Let's see, put up the projection here. But once again, I'll remind you, you can play anyone in captain. If you really want to go and get, Dwight Powell at 3.3K and start off your entry that way, you can then go get Luka, Ant, Kyrie, Cat, and then end it with Jaden Hardy. So, I mean, you can stack it up all you want. The only problem is Dwight Powell going to do enough to make that the right strategy? I doubt it, but you just never know. So if you're rolling out 150 lineups, you can play with your exposures and go overweight on guys, and make sure you get a little bit of exposure to those kinds of lineups just for fun. But that's just not the way I see it going. As far as guys, though, that we still want in our lineups that are kind of cheap and interesting, I will just remind you, Kyle Anderson, he's getting 17 and 20 minutes off the bench. He's kind of eating into Nas minutes. He's had 17 plus fantasy points in 3 straight games. So he continues to look like an awesome value at 3K. Not super interesting getting him into the captain just because the minutes aren't really there, but obviously you can do that if you want. Nah did get his minutes spiked a little bit last game, 20 minutes, 10 fantasy points. The production just has not been there. So he is 2.8K. He is viable just because it's a showdown slate, and you could have him as a ownership leverage on Kyle Anderson for sure, because Kyle Anderson is coming in at 37% owned, and where is he? And Nah is coming at 13. So certainly a ownership leverage for sure. And I was talking about this the other slate, and it didn't go well. But Nas was coming in crazy owned. He's coming 75% owned on the slate, which I can't really refute that at 5.2K in the utility. That is a really nice price still, even though he had been sitting around 4.4 or 4.6K. But Jaden McDaniels is the better bet to get minutes. He's going to get 32 to maybe even 40 minutes, and he's shown a ceiling. And here he is coming at 13% owned. So, I mean, I'm not saying you have to fade Nas to play McDaniels, but you could play McDaniels at 800 more at leverage if Reid can just kind of be held in check here. Like Reid had 21 fantasy points last game. If Jaden McDaniels would have come out and had his, big 37-point fantasy game, you have a 16-point edge on 75% of the field immediately. You can still pair them together just because they're both reasonably priced. But my favorite strategy would be to, in this case, consider going underweight on Nas and going, largely overweight on Jaden McDaniels, or really overweight. I mean, but yeah, Mike Conley is fine. 7.7K, 26 fantasy points last game, 35 the game before, 18 in game 1. So he does have a low floor, and not much of a ceiling, but he's going to be out there the whole game. Let's see, if you're looking at the Dallas side, I prefer PJ Washington at that price for sure. I mean, Mike Conley, the only thing that's appealing about Mike Conley is that he's not going to be very owned. 14% ownership. And if the ownership is going to gravitate towards PJ Washington, you can certainly make that pivot in a few of your lineups because you're going to actually save $200 to make that pivot. So it's certainly in play. Let's see who else for Minnesota stands out. Nobody else really, I don't think. Just want to make sure I touch on everybody in case you're interested in playing any of these players. No. So recap for Minnesota real quick. Love Anthony Edwards at captain. Cat and Rudy are viable captains. No problem with them at all. I like Naz Reid. There's nothing wrong with Naz Reid. He still remains too cheap at 5.2K. The only problem is he's mega chalk, 75%. So if he's going to be insanely chalky, I will certainly be underweight on him, and I'll be overweight on Jaden McDaniels, who, by the way, I still don't really trust. But after 2 down games, it's certainly possible that he bounces back and gets it going. And that's just such an ownership gap that I'd like to try to take advantage of that. I will eat the Kyle Anderson chalk, and I will probably go Rudy over Cat just because they're basically the same guy, and I'm saving money and getting like almost half the ownership with Rudy as opposed to Cat. None of that means you can't play Naz Reid and Rudy. I would just kind of take this strategy like overall when I'm looking at the slate and I'm playing a lot of different lineups. All right, over to the Dallas side we go. Let's see. Who did I not touch on yet? Derek Jones Jr. is getting a lot of minutes. So I don't really want to play him in the captain slot because of the lack of a ceiling. But with Derek Lively out, he should probably have his minutes even more solidified. 33 plus minutes in each of the last 4 games. Not much of a ceiling, pretty low floor. But if he's going to play and push for 35 plus minutes, he remains a pretty good value at 4.6K. Certainly viable, and 32% owned on a showdown slate is not a lot. So I would be a little bit overweight on him. Daniel Gafford at 39% owned, not carrying enough ownership for sure. Like I said, I do not mind a sprinkling in the captain. And at 6.6K in utility, he looks awesome with Lively out. He should get 30-plus minutes for sure. Jaden Hardy and Josh Green continue to be viable. Josh Green played 25 minutes last game, 21 minutes the game before. He has not been super productive. What do you have last game? 8.5 fantasy points. He hasn't topped 19 fantasy points in this series. So I don't feel great about him, but the price is nice. And on showdown slates, getting that salary saver is always important. Jaden Hardy is in the same boat, 2.4K. He only had 9 fantasy points last game. You can expect about 10 minutes from him. But honestly, if we're looking for value, I'm just sticking over on the Minnesota side where Kyle Anderson is 3K. I mean, I would just be like major overweight on Kyle Anderson, even though he's chalky. He's just the better play. That said, if you want to get different in a hurry, it looks like these guys aren't going to be super owned. Jaden Hardy, 10%. Yeah, okay. Josh Green's 48%, right? That's crazy to me. So I will absolutely fade the crap out of Josh Green or go severely underweight here. And it's just DFS is about taking stands. Could Josh Green come out and like get 25 fantasy points and it just screws up my night? Absolutely. It happens all the time. But if I can gain instant leverage on 50% of the field who are eating Josh Green chalk when I can pivot to Jaden Hardy, or I can drop down to Dwight Powell or Maxi Kleber, or I can just go eat the Kyle Anderson chalk instead, I'm going to do that. Or at least I'm going to be, different from the field in that regard. So if I'm doing 150 lineups, maybe I'll be dramatically underweight on Josh Green, and I'll split up my ownership to go overweight on Jaden Hardy or Kleba or, Kyle Anderson. Worth noting, Dwight Powell and Maxi Kleber, those are the guys that could be interesting values with Derek Lively out. Dwight Powell did get 8 minutes last game, 6.5 fantasy points. Not really the best per minute guy, so I don't love playing Dwight Powell, 0.82 fantasy points per minute on the year. But he's really cheap, and he's going to play a little bit at least with Derek Lively out, and Daniel Gafford can struggle and get in foul trouble. So I think Dwight Powell is okay at 2.2K for sure. And that's really nice that he's not going to be owned at all. The other guy would be Kleba. Let's see. I think he's questionable. Yeah, he's questionable. He has not yet played in this series. So even if he's active, do we trust that he's going to play? And do we trust that he's going to play well? And do we trust that he's going to play a lot? No, we don't. How could we? We don't know anything about him right now. So I would probably lean towards Powell, especially since Maxi Kleber is carrying like 15% ownership for some reason. That said, if you're doing a lot of lineups, Kleba is definitely still in play just because Lively isn't going to be there. I think I covered everybody for the Mavs. Yeah. So quick recap for Dallas now. Love Luka as the captain. It's easily my favorite Dallas captain. Kyrie is still viable at captain and solid at utility. Love PJ Washington at captain, and he's solid at utility. If I can get PJ Washington low owned and he can have that blow up game, I think that breaks the slate. Daniel Gafford is also pretty good at captain. Love him at utility as well. And the other guys are solid values. I would just personally get away from Josh Green because chalky Josh Green feels gross as hell. All right, that is going to do it for me. Hopefully this helps you out a little bit. If you have questions, throughout the day leading up into lock, you can always leave comments on our YouTube channel. And if I can get to them, I will. I can't always do that. I can't promise that, but I will try. But hopefully this helped you out. If it did, please give this video a like and also consider subscribing to the channel. That way you can help the community grow. You can help me know that I'm helping you. And you can also get alerted to future videos. We don't just do NBA DFS. We also do MLB. Taylor Smith will sometimes join me for MLB videos. We also will do NFL. And I've even done a couple UFL videos too. So you can also leave comments about what else you would like to see and just questions in general. But I hope you get a takedown tonight. And we'll see you at the top of the GPPs.